Hello and welcome to lecture number 37. This is topic 3.2, Social Life, Reuniting Black Families, and the Freedmen's Bureau. We'll begin with the learning objective regarding the Freedmen's Bureau, which asks you to describe the purpose of this agency. The Freedmen's Bureau was an agency established between 1865 and 1872 to aid in the process of Reconstruction. As we discussed in the last lecture, the two primary goals of the federal government during Reconstruction were to readmit and reconstruct the Southern Confederate States and to protect the rights of the newly freed people. The agency was officially called the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, and it was under the control of the U.S. Army, commanded by General Oliver O. Howard. Despite its noble intent to protect the rights of African Americans, the Bureau was consistently underfunded by Congress. At no time did it have more than 900 agents to manage the needs of the newly freed 3 million people in the South. Most of these agents were white, as the positions were primarily filled by Army officers, and there were few black officers in the military at the time. The Bureau's creation was one of the first federal efforts to address the systemic inequalities faced by African Americans after slavery, marking a significant, albeit imperfect, step towards civil rights. Some of the Bureau's objectives included helping to educate the newly freed population, assisting them in obtaining land and settling legal disputes, negotiating labor contracts, and providing food, medical care, and transportation. The labor contracts were particularly important because many newly emancipated people in the South, their only financial opportunity was to return to the plantations where they had been enslaved. The only difference was that they were now supposed to be paid for their labor, and the Freedmen's Bureau was supposed to help them secure fair contracts with their former enslavers. The Bureau also tried to help people navigate the difficult conditions of Reconstruction. It distributed clothing and food, particularly in areas like Georgia that were decimated by Sherman's campaign. Much of the infrastructure, including railroads, roads, buildings, and towns, were destroyed, leaving people vulnerable to famine and epidemics. The destruction during Sherman's March to the Sea, which aimed to cripple the Confederacy's war capabilities, had a lasting impact on the Southern economy and infrastructure. A smallpox epidemic that swept through the South affected both black and white Southerners. By 1866, the Bureau had distributed 13 million rations of food in the form of flour and grains. The Bureau also played a role in legalizing marriages, which we'll discuss in more detail shortly. It established schools and cooperated with religious organizations to staff them with teachers. The Bureau allocated $500,000 for this purpose. Additionally, it managed abandoned and confiscated property. Initially, General Howard attempted to set aside at least 40-acre plots for newly freed people through Circular 13, a special order issued by the Bureau. However, this effort was reversed along with Sherman's Special Field Order No. 15 because President Andrew Johnson pardoned many of the large landholders whose land had been confiscated. Sherman's Special Field Order No. 15 is often remembered for its promise of 40 acres and a mule to freed slaves, a promise that was never fully realized due to political opposition. The redistribution of confiscated land was a particularly unpopular move amongst the rest of the country, as it involved taking property without due process. The second learning objective is to explain how, after abolition and the Civil War, African Americans strengthened family bonds that had been disrupted by enslavement. The centuries-long institution of slavery had severely disrupted black families, as relatives were forcibly sold and separated, parents from children, siblings from each other, and spouses from one another, and relocated not just to other plantations, but sometimes to other states across the country. Enslavers chose the names for the enslaved, often ignoring the names they had chosen for themselves or their children. They were also rarely addressed by any last name. This dehumanization through naming was a tactic used by enslavers to strip individuals of their identities and to reinforce their status as property. On plantations, enslaved people often created kinship bonds and family traditions. For anyone separated from their family, whether they were the last ones left on a plantation from their immediate family or a single individual arriving alone at a new plantation, they would create kinship ties that were adopted, meaning that they would fill the roles of mothers, fathers, brothers, or sisters to ensure that the person could survive in the new environment. People also got married on plantations. Sometimes they even married across plantations, known as abroad marriages, where people would wait until weekends, Sundays, or nights when they weren't working to see their spouses. Marriages among enslaved people were sometimes celebrated with a ritual called jumping the broom, speculated to have emerged from West African traditions. The broomstick wedding was a form of resistance, allowing enslaved people to assert a form of marital commitment despite the lack of legal recognition. One historian, however, Daniel Remy Berry, suggests that the enslavers promoted this marriage ritual as a way to mock the enslaved people's inability to legitimize their marriages legally. However, after the Civil War ended, the practice fell out of favor as formerly enslaved people now had the legal avenue to formalize their marriages. Interestingly, the tradition of jumping the broom experienced a resurgence after the 1976 novel Roots and its TV adaptation, and it has since been incorporated into many Black wedding ceremonies. Finally, if spouses were separated by sale, sometimes upon arriving at a new plantation, they remarried or adopted a new family if they had been forcibly relocated. This created some tragic situations after the Civil War ended when people went searching for their estranged spouses, only to find that they had moved on and married someone else. These reunions, or lack thereof, highlight the emotional toll of slavery's forced separations, with many families never fully reuniting. Next, we'll discuss family reunification. After emancipation, African Americans searched for their kin who had been separated by the domestic slave trade. Most searches were unsuccessful due to the time and distance that had passed between them, but nevertheless, they used newspapers, word of mouth, and the Freedmen's Bureau to try and find their loved ones. Black newspapers sold ads to alert loved ones that someone was looking for them. An example of this is shown here on the screen, where a man named Samuel Dove was looking for information on his mother and sisters. They also visited contraband camps, former plantation homes, and black churches to gather any information on whether their loved ones might have ended up. As mentioned earlier, some found that their spouses had remarried after their separation, leading to difficult decisions about whether to stay with their new spouse or return to the original spouse. There is one documented case where a woman gave each of her husbands a 2-week trial period to determine who she would prefer to stay with for the rest of her life. Other primary sources reveal how some men who had remarried and started new families felt conflicted about leaving their old wives behind. In some cases, they continued to financially support the spouse they did not choose while living with the other one. While enslaved people tried to make their marriages as official as possible while they were enslaved, jumping the broom was only a symbolic act and could not be legally binding. After abolition, thousands of formerly enslaved people who were married sought to legalize their marriages. The Freedmen's Bureau issued Circular 11, which directed agents to record all marriages to give them legitimacy. This meant that their children were now legitimate under the law and could legally inherit property from their parents. Some people sought to make their marriages official in a more ceremonial way by having an actual wedding, often shared with as many as 70 other couples in mass weddings that became common at the time. It was not only important for couples to legitimize their marriages to symbolize their love, but it also impacted the types of pensions that people could receive, especially for black soldiers who served in the Union in the Civil War. If a soldier died, his now legitimate widow could continue to receive survivor benefits along with their dependents. The establishment of legal marriages was crucial for the economic stability of many black families, as it allowed widows to claim pensions that would otherwise have been inaccessible. After emancipation, newly married couples also began adopting new names that represented their status as free people. Common names included freemen or freedmen. They also sometimes took on names of prominent figures like Washington, or in some cases adopted the surname of their former enslaver. Although this may seem counterintuitive, it could help tie them to a specific location in case someone ever came looking for them. Another reason for this was to assert a connection to their heritage and to the legacy of those who had survived slavery, ensuring that future generations would remember the struggles and triumphs of their ancestors. In other instances, people who were the product of sexual assault by an enslaver on a black woman kept their enslaver's surname to serve as a constant reminder to that enslaver that they were part of that family and that such violence had occurred. Finally, as part of the post-Civil War search for family, a new tradition of family reunions among African Americans began. This tradition grew out of the post-emancipation efforts to reconnect with long-lost relatives and friends. Today, modern black families, even when separated by long distances, continue the tradition of traveling to gather and reconnect with loved ones, preserving and celebrating the history and resilience of freed people who sought to reunite with their kin after the war. These reunions often feature music and culinary traditions passed down through generations, maintaining a connection to their shared heritage. These reunions also serve as a means of preserving the oral histories and stories of survival, resistance, and resilience that are an integral part of the African American heritage. And finally, here's the recap. The Freedmen's Bureau was created by Congress in 1865 and was defunded in 1872. The Bureau was tasked with assisting newly freed people with their transition to freedom. Centuries of slavery had disrupted black families, and after abolition, freed people worked hard to find their loved ones from whom they were separated. Thousands of couples legalized their marriage once it became available to them, expanding their legal benefits. And finally, family reunions became a tradition among black families, exemplifying the journey to reconnect with kinship ties that had been severed by long distances. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, click the thumbnail on the screen. And if you would like more resources to help you study, you can visit apushlights.com/AFAM. I wish you the best of luck with your studies, and I hope to see you back on the next lecture.